Alright, in this video we're going to look at reading framework arguments framework arguments against untopical affirmatives, i.e. the situation is very specific. We're going to look at framework arguments that are read by the negative when the affirmative is not defending policy action. So, first we're going to discuss what is framework. Framework at its core is a debate about how debate rounds should be approached. What is the mentality? What is the purpose for debate rounds? What is the goal that we have for debate rounds? Is it supposed to produce really good knowledge? Is it supposed to be just a fun, quirky game? Is it supposed to be something like the real world? What is it that a debate round is supposed to be? That is a framework argument. And so a framework argument is going to operate like part counterplan, part topicality, and part impact turn. And it is read when the affirmative doesn't have a plan text or doesn't have an advocacy text that has a policy proposal. Sometimes there will be affirmatives that do have advocacy texts that do have policy proposals, but don't claim fiat or use USFG in their advocacy statement. Then you are going to be having a lot more like of a topicality debate in order to determine whether there's a violation there that's going to occur. So, the structure of framework. The structure of framework is very similar to that of topicality. You're going to have definitions. Usually you're going to define United States federal government, resolved, should. They're all popular choices. The goal with your definitions is to be able to articulate that policy making is what should be being talked about inside of the debate round based upon the resolution, i.e. the words in the resolution indicate that it should be a policy debate about government policy, usually happening by the United States federal government, and what that policy should be. So, you'll have definitions to be able to make it say, hey, the resolution says it must be about policy. You'll have a violation that explains how the affirmative's advocacy text or plan text or whatever they're doing in their 1AC does not meet those definitions of policy making. And then you'll have standards. And so the standards will all be things like fairness arguments and education arguments, maybe activism arguments. There will just be a general defense as to why policy making is good, and policy making should be how we think of policy debates. And this is the key area. The standards debate is really what makes framework different than topicality, because normally with topicality debates you aren't going to read a ton of cards on your standards. You're just going to think out a lot of what definition means for the topic as a whole, for limits, ground, etc. And really no one writes cards for your standards and topicality debates. However, in framework debates, there is a verbose and widespread literature base discussing about the values of Western humanistic liberalism, democracy, policy making, and why we should be focused on those types of things and why we need to be talking about them in as high school debaters. So, that's the big difference. So let's kind of break this down a little bit more. First, we're going to look at the topicality portion. This part of framework is like topicality, definitions and violations, and the affirmative will most likely read a counterinterpretation as well. And it will be a debate about what the interpretations allow and disallow. So you're going to want to talk about why your interpretations solve for or allow for lots of their standards to be solved for, i.e. if they're saying that feminist education is required, then you have to talk about why your interpretation allows for feminist education to take place. If you are affirmative and cheating, your counterinterpretation has to be able to explain why your counterinterpretation solves for fairness and ensures that the debates are still fair. So it's just like a topicality debate in the sense that you are going to have interpretations versus counter-interpretations, and you're going to be debating about what things are allowed via your definitions and interpretations and what things are disallowed. And then you're going to talk about how it solves a lot of their offense and still has some reasons why it's still preferable, i.e. things that their counter-interpretation can't solve for with their interpretation of debate. And this is really kind of a spot where debate can break down if people are too block dependent, because it is really, really important when you are extending across your definitions and your violations that you are explaining the interaction between your interpretation of debate and the 2AC arguments that were on the flow. You have to be able to explain those interactions about what is allowed and versus what is not allowed. I.e., if they make arguments, you have to either explain, A, why your vision for debate, your definitions, and your interpretation of debate either allows those things to take place, or you have to impact turn those things and say those things that they're wanting to do on the affirmative are actually cheating and bad, and here's a list of reasons why they're bad. And so you have to be able to actually engage those things. And if you don't engage them, it's real easy to become behind in this portion of the debate. It's why you can't be too reliant upon blocks. The counterplan portion. And there's several ways that framework will try to solve the affirmative. So, first, do it on the negative. If the knowledge produced by the affirmative is a good thing, and it's so important, then they can simply read the literature base that they are reading in the 1AC on the negative as a critique. Therefore, it allows the AF to not have to defend the status quo against various interpretations of what the status quo means, and allows them to pick what they want to defend by picking the 1AC. So think about it this way. When they read this on the affirmative, any affirmative can say the status quo is bad for any number of reasons. There is no limit to that. Right? There's an infinite number of ways that the status quo is bad. It is impossible as a negative to defend all those infinite numbers of the way the status quo is understood. So that becomes impossible. So the offer here is to read your lit base as a critique on the negative. So you would say, hey, here's how you could read this argument on the negative as a critique, and here's the reason why that's good for debate. And that reason is, when I read my 1AC, I have picked my ontology, my metaphysics, my epistemology. I have picked all of those things because I wrote the 1AC, and now I'm not having to defend the whims of a random author, but instead get to defend what I want to defend in the 1AC. And this is why do it on the neg has become a persuasive argument as to why it is a good idea to just read your critique literature on the negative and let the affirmative, and make the affirmative be about policy making. Still produces all the knowledge. There's no reason why every single debate has to be about critique stuff. You can have that education. Just let us have the AF to defend what we want to defend instead of being at the whim of your authors. The second way that framework can operate like a counterplan and solve the educational merits that the 1AC is trying to propose is that you could read a plan text, a policy plan text, that wouldn't violate your definitions or violations, and still be able to have advantages that are similar or identical to the ones that were read by the Untopical Aff. So, the Untopical Aff has read some random advantage. We'll call it the wedding ring advantage. right? A topical version says, hey, you can meet and be within our definitions of having a policy debate and still read the wedding ring advantage, but while still being topical. And that is good because it ensures there's negative ground for everybody. And so it becomes a way to be able to say, listen, you chose to cheat. You didn't have to cheat by being untopical. You chose to do it. And that's really important, gives you a lot of ethos, and also solves a lot of the education and fairness arguments that are had. The third way that it operates like a counterplan is that you will argue that Western humanistic liberalism, i.e. policy making, is good, and that policy making education, specifically about the resolution, can lead to developing policies that solve for the impacts of the 1AC or really big other impacts that would occur. And those other really big impacts outweigh the impacts of the 1AC. So the way it works like a counterplan is that you're going to read evidence that says policy making helps solve the problems that are isolated in the 1AC. If they say that there is racism or sexism going on in the world, you would need evidence that says policy making is an effective and efficient way of stopping racism and sexism, and therefore that education is important. The impact turn portion. So this portion operates very much on impact calculus. What is the biggest impact? The impact triad. Magnitude, time frame, probability. And you will focus on things like education and fairness. What is more important? Education that occurs in rounds, or is it more important that the rounds are fair? Is it more important to have a real world education, or an education that is accessible to everyone? Or is it more important that debate rounds are fair in order to have fair debates and know who really did the best debating? So education arguments will focus on how policymaking and liberalism are important to solve the 1AC impacts, and they will have an external impact that is not isolated in the 1AC that will be read as sort of a net benefit to your interpretation, i.e., something about this topic provides a particular education that is really important to stop this one impact from taking place. That impact outweighs any impacts in the 1AC. And so that offer a sort of impact turn type of idea in the sense that policymaking is good, you haven't done policymaking, here's a disadd to your method of how you've approached or thought about debate and how it should operationalized. Fairness arguments are also present. Fairness arguments will focus on testability, i.e. if you're not prepared to debate an argument, then you weren't able to accurately test the truth claims, therefore we don't know whether those arguments are true to begin with. It was impossible to know whether those arguments were true. And this is sort of a way to say, even if we concede arguments, don't deem them true just because we conceded them, because they were never tested to begin with. And then you have arguments about limits and possibility of being neg, because they spike out of all of your traditional arguments that you would read when you're negative. And so that would be a fairness debate. And if you look at some of our, on the website's T arguments, especially going for T and the 2 and R and those 7 things, there will be a lot of overlap between the fairness arguments presented in that video and the fairness arguments here. So, review of key arguments. Whether you're debating framework or you want to know the tricks, here's the thing that you can kind of rely upon getting an instant win or another team getting an instant loss if these things go conceded. So, if you are cheating and you are affirmative and you concede a topical version, you're going to lose. So if you're reading framework, make sure you have a topical version. Make sure you're persuasively arguing the topical version. 99% of the time, if you win topical version of the Aff, it is game over for the negative. or for the affirmative in their cheating, not policy making affirmative. Do it on the negative argument. Also, very good. If you can suck up their education arguments, you can solve for their education arguments while not being AF the way they were AF. Again, really good shortcut in order to be able to win debate rounds. Testability. This is one of those arguments that if you can't test an argument, then you don't know whether it's true to begin with. Therefore, shouldn't allow it to be true. And then switch side good. This is kind of inherent to some of those arguments that we were talking about earlier. But switch side essentially is the thesis that if you can do it on the negative, it is good to switch sides and debate the yes and the no to an issue in order to know what the other side will say to you in future arguments in the real world. I.e., you need to know both sides in order to be a true expert on the content that you are talking about. And so this video kind of went over kind of a crash course as to what it means to be negative reading framework against a team that doesn't have any